I'm going to move on to our next section, actually, which we've briefly covered, but I think there's a little bit more we can talk about in terms of the use of AI through the assessment process and candidates particularly using it. Where do we think that maybe there's sort of social norming or social pressure to use AI? Do we think that there are certain stages in the recruitment process where AI is acceptable, and there are certain stages where it's not? I mean, if we break down this, Tom, I don't know whether you or Becky, whether you've got some thoughts around where could it come in and be an acceptable point, and where would we like to remove it from, do you think, or guard against it, perhaps a better word?
Where I feel I can talk, I guess, from experience around where it's definitely not acceptable. Yeah. Okay, so where there is a red line, and the red line is for a specific test. It could be a numeric test or a cognitive test using AI, replacing a human is not acceptable, and organisations are starting to see this concept of improbable scores. So these are superhuman scores, so advancing 200 percentile. So that is not acceptable, because actually what we want to see are real candidates that can actually perform the role and pass those exams that are required and have that academic strength, and so thereby it's important that the candidate is absolutely authentic.
Tom, from a technology perspective then, how do you think technology can facilitate or manage against some of those concerns that Becky has?
I think it comes back to the earlier point we made, which is, are we going to embrace technology or embrace AI and say, no, it's going to be acceptable for this element of the assessment process, but not this element? Yeah. If we go back to the initial application form, they all look the same, so that almost rules it out. You might as well forget about having an application for, or a cover letter or something like, because they're all going to look the same. You can't differentiate between candidates. Right. Absolutely agree with Becky. If you've got a psychometric test or an aptitude test or situational judgment test or something like that, where you're trying to assess a candidate's behaviour within a specific role or their cognitive ability or their underlying natural capabilities, if they're using AI to basically cheat the system and get the perfect score, again, totally unacceptable and pointless again, because when you then get in the role, if they've suddenly got there and they've got a 90 percentile numeric reasoning score, they get into the they've got this great job at a leading top 5 or accountancy firm, and the first day they turn up and they say, right, off you go, and well, how do I switch on the computer, or how do I add, it's impossible.
I think it's setting. It's important that organisations set people up to succeed, and if they have not been genuine, or they've had support from AI, in specific aspects of the role, which are absolute requirements to pass certain tests or academic qualifications, then the likelihood is that they're not going to pass the vigour of those academic qualifications or perhaps become qualified. So further along down the track, it's a problem that is going to reveal itself. So it's really important to have the absolute integrity of the candidate in the process. But I do think that from an enablement point of view, AI can be used to help you articulate your CV better, to format your CV better. It can be used to format PowerPoint presentations. It can be used to take meeting notes. So I think from that perspective, AI is advantageous. But to Tom's point, where all CVs are looking the same, for example, if you plugged in, give me the perfect CV to be an accountant, and every single CV has gone through ChatGPT or Google Bard and it's presented the same CV, it's going to be very difficult to differentiate candidates. So I think there has to be some sort of human interaction with AI to ask the right questions, to try to represent yourself, as your best professional self as possible.
I think we talked a little bit about earlier some of the tools or the mitigations that companies are putting into place. So perhaps accepting that this is part of life, and then looking through the talent assessment journey when you've got a candidate pool through to post, for example, and saying, well, at certain points in this, we're going to be looking at the behaviours of candidates because we want to know whether there is an influence here from ChatGPT. And I think one of the things that I've read is around sort of looking at the keystrokes per minute, for example, restricting time, restricting access, or having cameras on. I don't know, I think whether we want to talk a little bit about where do we think in the process that we can put those checks and balances in. We all know the talent assessment process can be long and varied, but are there specific areas, do you think, Tom or Becky or Bertie, that we should be, could give us an insight as to whether this is an enabled application or whether this is an enhanced application?
It's very tricky, and I'm referring back to something that's called the Turing test, which was invented by Alan Turing, and it was meant to be the test whether a machine can be called intelligent. And we've had competitions that simulated this Turing test, which essentially means you've got a judge, a human, and a machine.
Right.
They communicate via a text-only interface, so it was kind of a typewriter, teletype thing initially. This was invented in the 1950s. And what we saw in later iterations of this Turing test in competitions, the programmers of the AI, the machines that were pretending to be human, just included hesitation, typos, etc., simulating to be human. And I can see this.
Dark AI, I've read about this. There's the emergence of dark AI. You know, you could.
I mean, if there are tools that probably are used also commercially for applicants to use, they will try to trick the assessors. By introducing some.
I think that's a really good point, and I think that there is a definite. If we're thinking about predictive modelling, it's going to take. The companies will be looking at predicting modelling in our HR analytics. So do we have the right candidate pool? Are these candidates most likely to be successful in our process? Are they going to predict job performance? That's from a HR perspective. From the candidate side, which is the enablement side, it might be, how will I get through this process making some mistakes to allow more authenticity?
Or perceived authenticity.
Perceived authenticity. So I think that that's interesting, and there's some psychological psychology behind this around your sort of almost like your other self, around that. I think from right now, it's important that in the recruitment process that the candidate that is presenting, if you think about some companies, you have multiple steps and they are assessed in different ways. So some of them are assessed via automated decision, some of them are assessed by humans that are screening in the process. So there are different touch points in the recruitment process, but what we need to make sure is that the candidate in that process is a real authentic candidate. So for example, a basic ID and V check. I think that facial recognition, similar to dating sites, not that I'm on them, but basically facial recognition should be absolutely part and parcel. I haven't seen it yet in the assessment process, but I think that we need to fundamentally understand is it a real person that's coming through the process, and also certain things that you can do, randomizing questions, for example, not having the same question banks, and also detecting improbable scores or unusual trends that are not normalized.
I think one of the, again, this is a subject we discussed recently, and I think one of the interesting ones was a couple of areas we can do. I mean, there are some ways you can do that. You can avoid, you can sort of disable cut and paste and things like that into questions. And as I say, you can structure the questions in certain ways so that they are maybe more yes or no, or then very much give me an example of, that sort of personalises it, which becomes harder for ChatGPT to have that life experience and then be able to articulate that in their answer. One of the interesting ones that I found as well was actually, it was really basic. It was just at the very start of your assessment process, you have an honesty sort of button or a statement that says, we are going to be assessing you. We want to assess you on your abilities, your motivation, your capabilities, your skills, etc. Therefore, we would kindly ask that you do not use ChatGPT or generative AI to improve your performance or your scores or your because we really want you. And the reason we do that, and you explain it, because ultimately we want to give you a job, we want you to be successful, we want you to still be working for us in 12 months' time. Yeah. Now, I hate to say it, if you come in and you're suboptimal for that particular role, but you use ChatGPT to make your application and your assessment process absolutely spot on for that particular role, well, you're going to get found out pretty damn quick once you get into the role. It's not going to take long before you're going to struggle, and sadly everybody loses.
So companies are starting to adopt integrity statements on their career portals, right through to integrity videos, candidate charters. I think it's important that this goes back to only 10% of organisations having an AI policy. Not only does there need to be an AI policy, there needs to be an AI recruitment policy. So if you think about 10% of companies have an AI policy, we can imagine that there's even less that have an AI recruitment policy. So I completely agree. It's about expectation management, because fundamentally the issues, like if you have used AI to over facilitate and to get through a recruitment process, at some point from a performance perspective, once you've joined the firm, some of the requirements that are required you may not be able to fulfill. So it's just actually preventing a longer term issue.
So it's something, obviously in academic writing, transparency in the form of referencing has always been there. We now require or encourage statements of how generative AI was used for the production of some work. We steer away from essays and go more onto kind of reflective pieces, assessing processes rather than just an essay. But I'd like to know if, say, an applicant handed in a CV and stated somewhere generative AI was solely used to improve the structure of this CV, would that have a positive effect on their chances?
I think it depends on, again, whether it's regulated industry or non-regulated, right? So I think that it's a question that a TA leader recently hypothesized at an event, and they said that and this was an experienced hire, not in early careers, and what they saw were common CV types that looked very similar, and so thereby I guess the question is how do we ensure that it is just being used for enablement and is not being used to mask integrity, for example, like over embellishing certain qualifications or things like that. So I think used AI or not, I think it's a really good idea actually, but actually when all of the CV types look the same, then it becomes very difficult, and so thereby it will require more time and validation points in the recruitment process and on the TA professional to meet more candidates, to humanly screen them. So there is a thought right now that recruitment will go back more vintage, because for a firm that I was working for, we moved back to vintage recruitment, so to create in-person type events, to create moments that matter, but also have AI technology enablement online in the process. But I think the trend will move back towards more human interaction in the recruitment process.